After helping a lost and confused elderly man, young man loses his job, but then a helicopter lands near his home. The sun was scorching and it was already past noon. Nicholas was bent over the earth, sweat streaming down his face as he removed weeds from the small plot of land his parents owned. The heat was oppressive, and each movement seemed to drain his strength, but he had no choice. The 20-year-old worked from Monday to Monday, as he was the sole provider for the household. His 60-year-old father sat on the porch, watching his son with a mix of pride and sadness. Years earlier, he had been in charge of that land, but a work accident had left him incapacitated. He vividly remembered the day his body gave out. A failure in the structure of the construction site where he worked had caused him to fall from a considerable height. Since then, his back had never been the same. Chronic pain was his constant companion, and any sudden movement would leave him bedridden for days. Struggling to hide his resentment and frustration, Nicholas's father had initiated a legal battle to obtain a disability pension. However, the system seemed to have forgotten him. Months had passed since he filed his claim, but the responses always came with excuses or requests for more documents. With each letter that arrived, hope diminished. He no longer knew what to do. He felt like a burden to his family. And although Nicholas never complained, his father knew how hard and poorly paid the work on the land was. Nicholas, for his part, tried not to think too much about the uncertain future. He focused on the manual labor, the daily routine that began before dawn and only ended when the sun set. Although he was exhausted, there was something about working the land that connected him to memories of better days, when his father could still lead the work. Each plant that grew, each fruit that ripened was a small victory, a reminder that despite everything, they were still there, holding on. While working the land, he thought about his mother, who was inside the house, probably preparing lunch with the little they had. She always kept busy, doing everything she could to keep the house in order and food on the table. She was a strong woman, but Nicholas knew that the weight of the situation also fell on her. Many times, she would wake up early to help in the fields or to care for Nicholas's father, who was having increasingly difficult nights due to the pain. Despite the hardships, Nicholas never stopped dreaming. He wanted more for his family. He wanted to provide them with a better life, one where his father would no longer have to worry about retirement, and his mother would not have to mend the same clothes repeatedly. He dreamed of seeing the land flourish, of a future where he might invest in better equipment, grow more, and maybe even sell his products in the city. But those dreams seemed far off. For now, all he could do was keep fighting, day after day, under the scorching sun, until justice finally recognized his father's right or until he found a way to change his reality. Even when exhaustion took over, Nicholas refused to give up. He knew that if he stopped, the entire family would crumble. And that, he could not allow. Nicholas's mother, Clara, was a middle-aged woman, her features marked by time and hard work. Although she was a few years younger than her husband, her health was seriously compromised. The signs of physical and mental wear and tear were evident in every movement she made, in the deep lines forming on her forehead, and in the constant fatigue that never seemed to leave her. For much of her life, Clara had worked in a factory in the neighboring town. The factory was the heart of the local economy, employing hundreds of people, including Clara, who started working there when she was young. She remembered how, at first, it seemed like a good opportunity. The salary, though modest, was enough to help with household expenses, and the proximity of the job allowed her to return home every day to care for her family. However, the reality of the factory was much harsher than it seemed. Clara worked directly on the production line, in a sector where chemicals were handled daily. The strong smells and toxic substances were part of her routine, but the lack of awareness and the need to support her family led her to ignore the early signs that something was wrong. As the years went by, Clara began to feel the effects of the environment on her body. First came the persistent headaches, which she attributed to fatigue. Then, respiratory problems started to develop and worsened over time, but Clara believed they were just frequent colds. However, the situation deteriorated. The doctors she managed to consult, always in brief and inattentive appointments, never gave a clear diagnosis. Stress, some said. Fatigue, others claimed. In the factory, the environment became increasingly unhealthy. The lack of oversight allowed the company to cut costs on safety, and employees, with no other job options, endured poor conditions. Clara watched her colleagues fall ill one by one, victims of the same substances slowly undermining their health. Some developed severe diseases, but when they sought help, the company dismissed them, refusing to take any responsibility. The breaking point came when Clara began to experience numbness in her hands and feet. Simple tasks, like holding a cup of coffee or walking, became difficult. Her lungs felt tight, and the persistent dry cough, which never left her, was now accompanied by a feeling of suffocation. Clara knew something was terribly wrong, but she was trapped in a cycle of work and illness that seemed impossible to escape. The situation reached its peak when the factory, which had been profiting from Clara's and her colleagues' labor for years, suddenly declared bankruptcy. It was a devastating blow to the community. Without warning, the doors were shut, and hundreds of workers, including Clara, were left to fend for themselves. There was no prior notice, no compensation, and all requests for justice were ignored. The company, citing financial difficulties, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a legion of sick and helpless workers. Clara, like many others, tried to seek help, but the responses were always the same: there are no records of irregularities, the company has gone bankrupt, there's nothing to be done. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. She found herself ill, unable to work, and without the means to seek proper treatment. The few resources the family had were directed towards the most basic needs, and the cost of medications that could ease her suffering was beyond their means. Over time, Clara became a shadow of her former self. The strong woman who once supported the household alongside her husband now struggled with simple tasks. The home, which had once been her refuge, became a prison where she faced her pain in silence, to avoid further worrying Nicholas and her husband. She knew her son already carried a heavy burden, and Clara's last wish was to be an even greater weight. Despite her health, Clara still forced herself to contribute as much as she could. She kept the house organized, prepared meals with what little they had, and whenever her strength allowed, she helped Nicholas in the fields. But each effort took its toll. Nights were long and lonely, filled with pain that kept her awake, and dark thoughts that made her fear for the family's future. She knew that without a solution, Nicholas would eventually exhaust himself, just like she and her husband had. Clara harbored a deep bitterness about what had happened, not only to her but to all her co-workers. She felt a silent rage against the system that allowed a company to destroy so many lives with impunity. Yet at the same time, she felt powerless, trapped in a reality she couldn't change. Each day was a struggle, and all she could do was keep going, hoping that somehow Nicholas would not be consumed by the same fate that had befallen her. Clara's retirement, while a temporary relief, did not bring the comfort the family had hoped for. After Years of struggling to secure the benefit, she was finally recognized as unable to work and began receiving a small government pension. However, the amount was so negligible that it barely covered the cost of the medications she needed to manage her health issues. The medication was essential to maintaining her quality of life, but the money left after buying it was almost non-existent. They lived on a constant edge, where any unforeseen event could plunge the family into an even deeper crisis. In light of this reality, young Nicholas found himself in a role many of his age would not have imagined. At 20 years old, he was the pillar supporting his home. The burden was heavy, but he bore it with determination, knowing that his parents depended entirely on him. Every morning, before the sun even appeared on the horizon, Nicholas was already up. At 3 in the morning, when most people were still in the comfort of their beds, he would head out to work the fields. The early morning cold often cut through his skin, and his calloused hands showed the result of his relentless effort. In the fields, he cultivated fruits and vegetables with tireless dedication. Each plant was cared for as if it were part of his family, knowing that the success of his harvest determined whether there would be food on the table in the coming days. The work was hard, demanding physical strength and endurance. But Nicholas never complained. He saw the land as the only chance to ensure a decent livelihood for his parents and clung to this opportunity with all his might. When the sun finally rose, marking the start of a new day, Nicholas was already on his way to the market. There, he set up his stall and organized the produce he had harvested. The market was a lively place, filled with vibrant colors, intense smells, and the constant buzz of vendors and buyers. But for Nicholas, it was more of a battleground. He needed to sell everything he could, always trying to keep a smile on his face, even when exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. The customers who passed by his stall often had no idea of the sacrifice behind those fresh products. To them, Nicholas was just another market vendor, but he knew that each sale made a difference between a day with or without food on his family's table. However, no matter how good the market profit was, it was never enough. Thus, Nicholas accepted any extra work that came his way. When he wasn't in the fields or at the market, Nicholas worked as a construction helper. He had no formal experience in the field but had learned through practice, observing and assisting other workers. The job was tough and physically demanding, but Nicholas approached each task with the same seriousness and dedication. He carried sacks of cement, mixed concrete, and built walls, always focused on his responsibilities. Nicholas knew he couldn't afford to turn down any job, no matter how difficult or poorly paid. Every opportunity to earn a few extra coins was a chance to slightly improve his family's situation. No matter how tired he was, he always found the strength to continue. Deep down, what motivated him was his love for his parents and his desire to provide them with a better life. Despite all his effort, there were days when the situation seemed hopeless. Nicholas's body was constantly exhausted, and the weight of responsibility sometimes felt unbearable. He rarely had time for himself, to rest, or to enjoy life. Unfortunately, despite all the hard work and long hours, Nicholas still couldn't gather enough money to cover household expenses. Bills piled up, and the pressure to buy food and medication for his mother increased each day. Nights, which should have been for rest, were marked by insomnia. Nicholas's thoughts churned like shadows, tormenting him with the constant worry of how he would support his family. The weight of responsibility rested on his young but already weary shoulders. Each new day, he sought a solution, a way out that could bring some relief to the financial difficulties they faced. Nicholas's home was situated in an open and isolated field, surrounded by vast stretches of land, with no neighbors nearby. This location, while offering some peace and quiet, also presented challenges, such as the distance he had to travel to reach the nearest city and run essential errands. One morning, after a long and exhausting walk, Nicholas arrived in the city. The sun was already high, and he could feel the sweat running down his forehead. As he walked through the bustling streets, something caught his eye. A colorful flyer pinned to a post announced the hiring of workers for the construction of a shopping mall that would be built nearby. His eyes lit up with new hope. Nicholas had some experience in construction, gained from temporary work as a masonry helper to supplement his income. The promised salary, though modest, represented a real opportunity to improve the situation at home. He knew that any extra money would be a great help. More than ever, he was determined to seize this opportunity. With a racing heart, Nicholas tore the flyer from the post and tucked it into his pocket, as if that piece of paper was the key to a better future. He knew he needed to act quickly to apply for the position, as opportunities like this didn't come around often. That very afternoon, he went to the employment agency listed and submitted his application, hoping to be selected. In the following days, Nicholas waited anxiously for a response. Every time he heard footsteps approaching his door, his heart leaped in hope of good news. The waiting was agonizing, but he remained steadfast, working tirelessly in the fields and with his daily chores, with the expectation that soon he might have a job offering a bit more financial stability. Nicholas could hardly believe it when he received the news that he had been hired. Joy overwhelmed him, and the weight he carried on his shoulders seemed to lighten, even if just a little. Even though it was a temporary job, it meant a lot to him and his family. He woke up even earlier than before, leaving the house before dawn, determined to give his best each day. On the construction site, Nicholas was a model of dedication. He followed the supervisor's instructions meticulously, was always ready to help his colleagues, and stayed focused on the tasks assigned to him. Every brick laid, every wall raised, was done with care and precision. He knew this job was temporary. But to Nicholas, it was more than that. It was a chance to provide a better life for his parents, to ensure that there was always food on the table, and that his mother's medication was consistently available. However, not everyone viewed his dedication favorably. Among the workers, some began to murmur. To them, Nicholas's attitude seemed like an attempt to stand out too much, to present himself as the perfect employee. Malicious comments started to circulate, and the already tough environment became even more strained. Look at the goody-goody, always arriving early and doing everything right. Must be trying to suck up to the boss, some would say. Nicholas heard these words but tried not to let them get to him. He knew he wasn't there to compete or show off, but to ensure his family's livelihood. Every workday was a battle to keep that job. The thought of losing this opportunity because of misunderstandings or jealousy terrified him. To him, responsibility was a serious matter, and he could not afford to fail. Despite the disdainful looks and whispered remarks behind his back, Nicholas continued to work with the same dedication. He had no time to waste on intrigues. His focus was on a single goal, to keep that job and perform his duties with honesty and effort. Days went by, and work progressed. Gradually, Nicholas began to notice that, despite the initial resistance, some of the colleagues who had previously criticized him began to respect him. They saw that he wasn't trying to be better than anyone else, but was simply fighting for survival, just like everyone else there. Others, however, continued to harbor suspicion and resentment. But Nicholas learned to deal with it. He knew that, anywhere, there would always be those who didn't understand his motivations. What mattered was that he was doing his best. He needed that job, and nothing would stop him from continuing to fight for his family. A few days passed. Nicholas, once again, was heading to work. He walked through the fields, still early in the morning, to arrive on time. The darkness around him was broken only by the light of the moon and stars, creating a serene environment that contrasted with the unease he felt. As he moved across the terrain, Nicholas noticed a strange figure in the distance. The silhouette seemed almost ghostly in the twilight. "What is that?" he thought, his steps slowing as his eyes tried to make out the figure in the distance. As he got closer, he realized it was a person moving slowly, as if drifting in a world they didn't fully understand. The sight of someone alone and seemingly lost at that hour and in such an isolated area stirred a mix of fear and curiosity in Nicholas. How could someone be here at this time? There are no nearby houses, and the area is deserted, he reflected, his mind wrestling between concern and doubt. Despite his apprehension, he decided to approach, feeling it was the right thing to do. As he got closer, the figure turned out to be an elderly man. He was well dressed, with clothes that, although a bit wrinkled, seemed to be of good quality. The elderly man looked disoriented, with his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if trying to understand where he was or what was happening. The expression on his face was a mix of worry and confusion. Nicholas, trying to stay calm, approached even closer and spoke in a gentle and reassuring tone. "Hello, are you all right? Do you need help?" The old man looked at Nicholas, his expression of confusion not fading. His gaze seemed to search for something familiar in the young man standing before him. "I left home a little while ago. I was playing with my 5-year-old granddaughter, but I don't know how I ended up here," the old man replied, his voice trembling slightly, as if he himself were trying to understand the situation. Worried about the elderly man's well-being, Nicholas asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Fabio," the old man answered, with an air of doubt and insecurity about his own identity. The response seemed to be a struggle, as if he were trying to remember something that should have been obvious but was eluding his mind. Nicholas observed Fabio more closely. He noticed that, despite being well-dressed, the old man appeared exhausted and disoriented. His feet were bare and somewhat injured, as if he had been walking for a long period without stopping. Nicholas's concern grew, and he felt a strong urge to help in any way he could. "You look tired and hungry. Come with me, I'll take you to my house. There, we can try to understand what happened and find a solution," Nicholas said, extending his hand to Fabio. Fabio looked at the extended hand and, after a moment of hesitation, accepted the help. With visible effort, Nicholas helped the old man to his feet and began guiding him toward his home. As they walked, Nicholas couldn't help but think about the elderly man's precarious situation and the responsibility he was assuming, but he also felt a deep compassion and a desire to ensure Fabio was safe and well cared for. Nicholas watched with concern as Fabio's bare, injured feet. It was evident that the old man had been walking for a long time. The wounds on his feet were red and swollen, and the young man felt a heavy weight in his heart upon realizing the extent of the suffering the elderly man had endured. The lack of proper footwear and Fabio's weakened state only worsened the situation. As they neared his home, Nicholas noticed that Fabio was visibly weakening. The old man was beginning to stagger, his eyes closing in a silent struggle against fainting. The sight of the elderly man on the verge of losing consciousness made Nicholas act quickly. Without hesitation, he crouched down and, with care and strength, lifted Fabio into his arms. The old man's weight was light compared to the relief Nicholas felt at being able to help. With Fabio in his arms, Nicholas quickened his pace toward his home. The path seemed longer than ever. And every step felt like an additional challenge. The field was deserted and silent, amplified by the urgency of the situation. The moon still lit the way, but the young man felt the weight of the accumulated hours and the responsibility he carried. Upon arriving home, Nicholas found his parents in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Nicholas's father, at 60 years old with deteriorating health, struggled to rise upon seeing his son enter. Nicholas's mother, despite her weakened condition, rushed to the door with a look of surprise and concern at the sight of the stranger being carried by her son. She was uncomfortable with the idea of taking in a stranger, but the man's need and condition quickly convinced her to help. "What happened to him?" his mother asked, looking at Fabio with a worried expression as she tried to hide her discomfort. "I found him in the field. He was lost and his feet were injured. I don't know where he's from, but he seemed to be in a critical state," Nicholas explained, trying to stay calm. Although still visibly unsettled, his mother prepared a place for Fabio to lie down. She carefully covered him with blankets and did her best to make the elderly man as comfortable as possible. The difficulty in reaching help due to the lack of cell phone signal only added another layer of frustration to the situation, but for now, the focus was on ensuring Fabio received basic care. As the hours passed, Fabio began to regain some of his strength. Nicholas stayed by his side, offering water and something light to eat as the old man started to recover from his hunger and thirst. Although Fabio was still confused, he began to respond with more clarity. I was playing with my granddaughter," the old man murmured, with a distant look. "But I don't remember anything else. Where am I?" Nicholas tried to learn more about Fabio's background, but the old man was so disoriented that he could barely provide additional information. Fabio seemed increasingly focused only on trying to recover his memories and understand where he was. Meanwhile, a small box of medications was beside the elderly man. Without a label and looking generic, Nicholas hesitated to administer them, fearing that they might be more related to Fabio's debilitated state than to a cure. The uncertainty about the contents of the box only heightened Nicholas's sense of helplessness. The family tried to offer as much support as possible, knowing that without a cell signal to seek external help, having Fabio at home was the only immediate option. The young man continued to stay by Fabio's side, watching him carefully, while hoping that the old man would soon recover fully and provide more information about his identity and situation. When Nicholas glanced at the clock, his heart skipped a beat. The time to clock in was rapidly approaching, and he was still at home, taking care of Fabio. Panic set in. He knew he was about to miss a day of work, something he could not afford to happen. The anguish was palpable as he tried to decide what to do. "Dad, Mom, I need to go now," Nicholas exclaimed, his face marked by worry. "Please, take good care of him. I'll run to work." Nicholas's mother, with an expression of understanding and empathy, nodded her head. She had grasped the gravity of the situation and knew that her son's job was crucial for the family's survival. His father, despite his weakened condition, made an effort to help. Both prepared to ensure that Fabio would be safe and comfortable while Nicholas hurriedly said his goodbyes. Nicholas dashed out of the house in a desperate run. The road to work seemed endless, and the heat of the sun began to weigh down, intensifying the discomfort of the run. Every step felt more difficult than the last, but he kept moving, knowing he could not afford to stop. His mind was filled with conflicting thoughts, concern for Fabio's condition and fear of losing his job. The Run across the field, already a grueling task in itself, was exacerbated by the urgency of the situation. Nicholas took brief stops to catch his breath and hydrate, but he didn't let his breaks extend. Every lost minute could mean another irreparable delay. As the city approached, the young man tried to pick up the pace, but his strength was waning. The route to work, which normally took a good part of the day, seemed to stretch endlessly. He watched the clock with growing anxiety and thought about how his tardiness might affect not just his day but his position at work. Finally, after an exhausting run and several forced breaks along the way, Nicholas arrived at work 4 hours late. The building was unusually hectic, and several employees were already there, with expressions of curiosity and disdain. As he walked in, Nicholas felt all eyes on him. Frustration and exhaustion were visible on his face as he headed to the office to explain his delay. His co-workers murmured among themselves, questioning the reason for his prolonged tardiness, something unusual for him, known for his diligence and punctuality. His boss, an authoritative figure not known for his patience, waited for him with a grave expression. The disapproving look from his boss made it clear that there was little room for excuses. "Nicholas, you know how important punctuality is. We lost a whole day of work because of your delay. We can't accept this happening again," the boss reprimanded. The young man tried to explain the situation, but he knew that his words could not change the decision that was about to be made. He was at the limit of his endurance and desperate to keep his job. However, the seriousness of the delay and the lack of concrete explanations made the situation seem even more dire. As he talked to his boss, Nicholas glanced at the clock and thought about the critical situation he had left at home. The desire to be in 2 places at once, helping Fabio and fulfilling his work duties, was an impossible reality. The feeling of helplessness and frustration only grew with the weight of his boss's words and the realization that his daily struggle was far from finding an easy solution. With a heavy conscience and a sense of defeat, Nicholas returned to his workstation, trying to focus on what he needed to do. He knew that, despite the explanations and apologies, the impact of the delay was already made and that the struggle to balance his personal and professional responsibilities was far from over. When Nicholas entered the workplace, he immediately noticed that something was different. Several employees watched him with a mix of curiosity and disapproval, their gazes not going unnoticed. This was unusual, as delays were relatively common and rarely garnered such attention. The constant murmuring among colleagues seemed to carry a tone of criticism, making Nicholas wonder if there was something more at play. His heart raced when he was called to the management office. With a tight stomach, he walked down the hallway toward his boss's office, his mind racing with thoughts of what might have gone wrong. The tension was palpable, and as he approached the door, he began to wonder if he had made a mistake larger than just being late. Upon entering the office, he found his boss sitting behind the desk, with an expression of frustration that left no doubt about how angry he was. The boss looked up from the paperwork and fixed a severe gaze on Nicholas. "Sit down," the boss ordered, and Nicholas settled into the chair in front of him, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "We lost an entire day of work," the boss began, his voice heavy with anger. "No one could work because of your irresponsibility in not arriving early and bringing the key. We had to call a locksmith to open the door where the employee safety equipment was stored." Nicholas felt a chill run down his spine at the words. He knew that the lack of access to safety equipment could cause major problems, but he had no idea it would lead to such a serious crisis. He tried to explain the situation, but his words seemed insufficient to reverse the negative atmosphere that had settled. "I really didn't know the key was so crucial. I was helping an elderly man in need and ended up being late, Nicholas said, trying to stay calm. His boss did not seem impressed. The expression of disapproval and frustration did not waver as he continued the explanation. I understand that unexpected events happen, but that's no excuse for compromising the company's operation. The situation could have been avoided if you had been more responsible. Nicholas felt his face flush with shame and frustration. His attempt to be a good employee and help someone in need seemed to be working against him. The weight of the accusation was overwhelming. And he knew that the issue was not just about the delay but also about the responsibility now at stake. I did my best, Nicholas insisted, trying to defend himself. It was not my intention to cause problems for the company. The boss sighed deeply, clearly tired of the conversation. It's not about intention, Nicholas. It's about results and the impact your actions have on the company. We'll have to make a decision on how to proceed from here. Nicholas felt his heart sink. The conversation was clearly heading toward an unfavorable outcome. The boss continued to explain that the company was considering more severe measures due to the gravity of the problem and the impact on the workday. We need to assess your performance and responsibilities. A situation like this cannot happen again. The boss concluded, with a tone that made it clear that the situation was far from resolved. Nicholas left the office with a feeling of desolation. The burden of responsibility he carried at home and his desire to help Mr. Fabio seemed to have triggered a series of unexpected consequences at work. He knew he needed to find a way to balance his priorities and, above all, try to regain his superior's trust. As he returned to his workstation, Nicholas's mind was overwhelmed with conflicting thoughts. He wondered how he could have handled the situation better and if there was anything more he could have done to prevent the problem. The anguish and uncertainty about his future at the job loomed over him, adding a new layer of stress to the already difficult situation he found himself in. When the boss led Nicholas to the cabinet and asked him to open it, the young man felt a chill run down his spine. The boss seemed to be waiting for something, and Nicholas couldn't understand why his cabinet was the focus of so much attention. With a trembling hand, he turned the lock and opened the door. What he saw inside left him paralyzed. The key to the room where the safety equipment was stored was hanging on the hook. Nicholas looked at his boss with a look of confusion and despair. He knew he was not responsible for that key and had never had possession of it. His heart began to race as he turned to face his co-workers, who were nearby, watching the scene with a look of restrained satisfaction. What began to unfold in his mind was a scenario he had never imagined, a conspiracy against him. He remembered some cold stares and malicious whispers he had noticed over the past few days. It was not hard to see that some people had a negative view of him, but he had never imagined it could escalate to such a degree. The pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. The idea that the key had been placed in his cabinet to incriminate him seemed increasingly plausible. I can't believe this, Nicholas murmured to himself as he tried to process the harsh reality of the situation. They set me up. The boss, noticing Nicholas's shocked expression, continued with an unfeeling tone. The situation is clear. The key was in your cabinet, and that's enough to justify our decision. The responsibility to ensure that the company could operate smoothly was on you. Nicholas wanted to defend himself, explain that he had no control over the key and that he was merely trying to help someone in need, but he knew his words would likely go unheard. He was in a precarious position, with no evidence to support his innocence. Even with the truth in hand, he was trapped in a game where others had already determined the outcome. I understand your side, but the evidence is clear, the boss said with a tone of disdain. The company cannot risk the continuity of its work because of a problem like this. The decision has been made. The sense of injustice was overwhelming. Frustration and helplessness consumed Nicholas, who knew that even with all his good intentions and efforts, it wasn't enough to reverse the situation. He felt betrayed and helpless, not only by the company but by the colleagues who had contributed to his dismissal. When he was officially informed of his dismissal for cause, Nicholas left the office with a feeling of absolute defeat. The walls of the building seemed to close in around him, and every step he took toward the exit was weighed down by an emotional burden that felt almost unbearable. He looked one last time at his co-workers, now a sea of indifferent and even satisfied faces at his downfall. That night, returning home, Nicholas faced the harsh reality that he had lost his job, and with it, the main source of income for his family. The future seemed uncertain, and the worry about his parents' situation, the need to pay bills, and find a new way to make a living was now an even heavier burden. The anguish and sense of betrayal were palpable, and the hope that things would get better seemed increasingly distant. As he walked back to his small house in the countryside, the thoughts about what had happened at work and what was to come weighed heavily on his mind. The feeling of being in a dead end loomed over him, and he wondered how he would face the challenges ahead. The future, which once seemed a difficult path, now appeared to be an impassable road, filled with obstacles and injustices. When Nicholas arrived home, the sky was already darkening, reflecting the weight of his sadness. The solitary walk back home seemed to have taken hours, and his steps, tired and dragging, carried the weight of his recent dismissal. He felt a mix of physical and emotional exhaustion as he approached the small house he shared with his parents. As he entered, he found his father sitting at the table, reading a newspaper, and his mother in the kitchen, preparing something for dinner. The environment seemed normal, almost comforting, but the news Nicholas was about to deliver would quickly change the tone of the evening. With a deep sigh, he tried to find the right words, but they seemed to get stuck in his throat. "Dad, Mom," Nicholas began, his voice wavering. I lost my job." The silence that followed was deep and heavy. His father looked up from the newspaper, the expression of concern and understanding visible on his face. With a gentle gesture, he moved toward Nicholas and embraced him, offering a silent comfort that spoke more than words could. The hug was a reminder of the unconditional support his father had always tried to offer, despite his own limitations. "I'm sorry, son," his father said, his voice muffled by emotion. "You did your best. We'll get through this together." His mother's reaction was a stark contrast to his father's. She was in the kitchen, her hands frozen in the middle of her task. When Nicholas delivered the news, she turned slowly, her face twisted in a mix of frustration and sadness. "You've always been such a good person," she said, her voice carrying a suppressed tone. "Always trying to help others, even when it means hurting yourself. That's what happens when you put others before yourself." Nicholas felt a pang of pain hearing those words. He knew his mother was expressing the accumulated frustration over the years, seeing her son incessantly sacrifice himself, only to be hurt in return for his kindness. But instead of feeling discouraged, he felt a new wave of determination. He had always believed that empathy and helping others were important values, even if it meant facing challenges. "Mom, I just wanted to do the right thing," Nicholas replied with a tone of dejection, but also firmness. "I can't stop helping people, even when it puts me in trouble. I just wanted to do the best I could." His mother sighed and approached, placing a comforting hand on Nicholas's shoulder. She knew her son had a big heart and that his empathy was one of his most notable qualities. But seeing him suffer repeatedly because of his kindness deeply worried her. "I understand, Nicholas," she said with a softer tone. "I just want you to know that, even though you have a generous heart, you need to take care of yourself too. It's not fair that you hurt yourself trying to help others." Nicholas nodded, understanding his mother's concern. He knew that despite the pain and injustice he felt, he needed to find a way to move forward. His parents depended on him, and he couldn't afford to give up. The struggle to support his family was far from over, and now more than ever, he needed to be strong. After a silent dinner, with sadness hanging in the air, Nicholas retreated to his room. The night was filled with thoughts and worries about the future. He looked out the window at the starry sky, reflecting on the challenges ahead. The sense of injustice and the weight of responsibility were heavy, but the desire to do what was right and take care of his family was greater. With a deep sigh, he prepared himself to face the next day, determined to find a new way forward despite the adversities. Days passed, and with the job loss and increasingly tight finances, Nicholas found himself forced to return to working in the fields. He resumed his daily activities, planting and harvesting what he could to sell at the local market. The weight of responsibility was evident on his shoulders, and the grueling hours in the field, often under the scorching sun, seemed insufficient to cover all the growing expenses. The situation worsened further with Mr. Favio's arrival at his home. With one more person to feed and care for, the costs increased significantly. Favio, though frail and confused, needed basic care such as food and medication, which became an additional burden for Nicholas. In an effort to resolve the situation and find a solution for the mysterious elderly man, Nicholas decided to call the police. The visit from the authorities brought a wave of frustration and discouragement. The officers, upon examining the case, informed Nicholas that there were no records of Favio in any official databases. Without clear identification and lacking evidence that Favio was a missing person with a registered help request, they claimed there was nothing they could do and left, leaving Nicholas in an even more desperate situation. With no other options, Nicholas decided to take Favio in at his home. The elderly man, despite his difficulties and confusion, became part of Nicholas and his parents' daily life. However, adding another person to the house only aggravated the already precarious financial situation. The concern about daily expenses intensified, and Nicholas found himself constantly on the brink of exhaustion. One day, a friend of Nicholas, noticing the young man's desperate situation, suggested an idea that, while not guaranteed to succeed, might at least offer some hope. He recommended that Nicholas post a photo of Favio on a missing persons website. The idea was that, with the help of the internet, someone might recognize the elderly man or provide useful information about his identity and family. Nicholas, though skeptical about the effectiveness of the suggestion, decided to follow the advice. He took a recent photo of Favio and posted it on various missing persons sites and forums. In the post, he included a brief description of the situation, mentioning that the elderly man had been found wandering alone and was now under his care. Deep down, he hoped that something would come of it, but the lack of hope and doubt about the possibility of success pervaded his thoughts. Night fell, and Nicholas lay down exhausted, struggling with the insomnia that had been plaguing him. As he wrestled with worries about his family's future and Favio's well-being, he tried to maintain a positive attitude. He knew he needed a solution, and any small progress would be a light at the end of the tunnel. However, reality was far from kind, and he continued to bear the weight of his responsibilities and the unknown. Time seemed to drag on, and each passing day was a challenge, not only to find a solution for Favio but Also to deal with his own difficulties and keep hope alive. He needed to find a way to improve the situation, and while struggling to balance everything, the nights were filled with dreams of better days. And the determination to move forward despite the obstacles in his path. A few weeks later, Nicholas received a call from a woman who said she wanted to meet Fabio in person. She asked for his address so she could visit him. Nicholas's mother was alarmed and immediately expressed her concern. "How can you give our address to a stranger, my son? You need to stop being so kind. This woman, or whoever she is, could harm you." Nicholas, however, was determined to help the elderly man find his family. Despite his mother's warnings, he didn't think about the possible consequences and believed that by helping Fabio, he was doing the right thing. He saw a chance to restore dignity and hope to someone who seemed to have lost everything, and that was more important to him than any precaution. The next day, Nicholas and Fabio were outside the house, strolling through the countryside. The morning was clear, and the sunlight was beginning to warm the air when they spotted, in the distance, a young woman walking towards them. The woman appeared to be in a great hurry, and her brisk pace indicated that she was eager to reach her destination. As the young woman got closer and finally saw Fabio's face, she could not contain her emotion. With tears in her eyes, she ran to him and embraced him with an intensity that conveyed both relief and love. "Grandpa, I've missed you so much," she exclaimed, wrapping him in a tight hug. Nicholas and Fabio were astonished. The elderly man, who had previously mentioned that his granddaughter was only 5 years old, was now facing a young adult woman. The woman, who introduced herself as Eduarda, appeared to be at least 20 years old, which starkly contrasted with Fabio's description. Fabio's confusion was palpable. He tried to process the situation, but his mental state was compromised. Fabio had remembered his granddaughter as a little girl, not as the grown woman standing before him. Eduarda tried to speak with him, calling him Grandpa and attempting to reconnect, but Fabio was lost in a whirlwind of disconnected thoughts. "Grandpa, it's your granddaughter, Eduarda," she said, with a mix of sadness and hope. "I finally found you." Nicholas watched the scene, perplexed. He saw the emotion in Eduarda's eyes and Fabio's struggle to comprehend the reality around him. There was no doubt that she was Fabio's granddaughter, but the difference between the image the elderly man had of his granddaughter and the reality of the adult woman in front of him was a profound shock for everyone. Eduarda, with a distressed look, tried to explain the situation to Nicholas. She revealed that years ago, Fabio had begun showing signs of dementia, and the family had lost contact with him. The image Fabio had of his granddaughter was of a small child, as that was the last clear moment he remembered. Over time, Fabio's memories had become fragmented and distorted, making it difficult for him to recognize Eduarda now that she had grown up. As Eduarda spoke with Fabio, she tried to recall shared moments from the past and looked for any sign of recognition on her grandfather's face. The reunion was emotional and challenging, as despite the hug and tears, the temporal distance and Fabio's mental state created an almost insurmountable barrier. Nicholas watched the scene with a mix of relief and sadness. He had done the right thing by helping Fabio find his family, but the elderly man's suffering and the complexity of the situation were daunting. He knew that, despite having reunited grandfather and granddaughter, the journey to restore Fabio's health and clarity was just beginning. Eduarda, with a heavy heart and hope, continued to talk to her grandfather, hoping that with time and patience, she could help restore some order to Fabio's confused mind. Nicholas, for his part, felt relieved to have fulfilled his mission of helping, but also understood that many challenges remained ahead for Fabio to find peace and stability again. Shortly after the emotional reunion between Fabio and Eduarda, a sudden noise cut through the air. Everyone looked up to see a helicopter approaching rapidly. The sound of the rotors was loud and enveloping, creating a sense of urgency and anticipation. The helicopter landed gently on a flat area near Nicholas's house, kicking up a cloud of dust and dry leaves. When the helicopter doors opened, an elegant man, dressed in a dark suit and tie, stepped out with a firm and decisive stride. His authoritative demeanor and the worried expression on his face showed that he was there for something serious. He went directly to Fabio, who was still dazed from the reunion with his granddaughter. "Dad, it's been so long," the man exclaimed, his voice filled with emotion upon seeing the elderly man. Nicholas, who was observing everything with a mix of surprise and perplexity, couldn't understand the situation. The fact that Fabio was important enough to warrant the arrival of a helicopter and such a well-dressed man was something he had never imagined. Eduarda also appeared stunned, but her surprise quickly gave way to intense concern. She looked at the man, now identified as Estevao, and asked, "Dad, how did you know we were here?" Estevao looked at his daughter with an enigmatic gaze and replied, "I have my contacts, daughter. Nothing happens without me knowing." Eduarda frowned, her expression becoming a mix of frustration and anger. She seemed to be struggling to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed the intensity of her emotions. With a visible effort to not show more displeasure, she turned to Fabio and said, "Come on, Dad. You need to go home." Fabio, still with an expression of confusion and restlessness, began to walk towards the helicopter, supported by Estevao. The elderly man looked at Eduarda and Nicholas, his mind trying to process the reality around him. Fabio's gaze was a mix of relief and disorientation, reflecting how much he was struggling to understand what was happening. The helicopter waited, its engine softly rumbling, ready to take Fabio and Estevao back. When they finally boarded the aircraft, Eduarda remained on the sidelines, her face marked by concern. She did not join them, staying at the edge of the field, watching the helicopter take off and disappear into the horizon. Nicholas, still near Eduarda, sensed the tension in the air and the worry etched on her face. When Eduarda murmured softly, Nicholas could hear, "Something bad is going to happen again." Her voice was laden with resigned sadness, as if she knew that Fabio's return was not the end of their problems, but the beginning of something more complex and difficult. Nicholas, with a heavy heart from the uncertainty, turned to her and asked, "Will he be okay?" Eduarda shook her head with a look of uncertainty and sadness. "I don't know," she replied, her voice filled with discouragement and concern. Nicholas felt a knot in his stomach upon hearing the response. He knew that, although reuniting Fabio with his family was a relief, the situation was far from resolved. The tension between the desire to help and the harsh reality of the challenges still to come left a feeling of unease hanging in the air. As the helicopter disappeared, Nicholas and Eduarda found themselves in a heavy silence. Both were aware that Fabio's journey was far from over, and the uncertainty of the future loomed over them like a dark cloud. Eduarda, still with a look of worry and relief from recently discovering her grandfather, asked Nicholas how he had found Fabio. The young man explained in detail what had happened, from the moment he found the elderly man disoriented in the field, through the challenges faced in caring for him, and finally receiving the unexpected visit from Fabio's daughter. As Eduarda listened to the full explanation, a look of understanding began to form on her face. She paused, as if organizing her thoughts before revealing the truth about Fabio. "Now it all makes more sense," she began, with a tone that mixed relief and sadness. My grandfather was a successful man. He was a wealthy businessman, known throughout the region for his influence and the prosperous businesses he ran. Eduarda looked down for a moment, as if reliving painful memories, before continuing. However, a few years ago, Fabio started showing signs of dementia and forgetfulness. His condition gradually worsened. One day, when I came home, I realized he had disappeared. There were no signs of struggle or anything unusual. Hours passed, and he didn't show up. My mother and I, desperate, began searching for him all over the city. She paused, her gaze distant and melancholic. We begged for help, called the police, and even reached out to the media, but the searches were not very productive. My father, Estevao, who should have been by my side during this crisis, seemed indifferent to Fabio's disappearance. In fact, he appeared increasingly indifferent, as if the disappearance of his father was none of his concern. Eduarda shook her head, the disheartenment evident in her gesture. The truth is, while my mother and I were devastated and doing everything we could to find him, Estevao was more concerned with the business and controlling my father's assets. By the time we finally got the authorities to start the search, it was too late. Fabio seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Nicholas listened attentively, now understanding the depth of the situation involving Fabio and his family. He realized that what seemed to be a simple search for a lost elderly man had much deeper and more complex roots. Eduarda, visibly tired and emotional, continued. My father saw Fabio's situation as an opportunity. With his dementia and the confusion it was causing, Estevao was able to get rid of him and keep all the assets. He paid someone to take care of Fabio and keep him hidden, away from our sight. That was the last thing he did before I mustered the courage to leave and restart my life away from that toxic environment. Nicholas, shocked by the revelation, felt an additional weight on his shoulders. The situation was far more serious than he had imagined. He looked at Eduarda, who was struggling to hold back tears. I know it's hard to hear this, but I need to thank you, Nicholas. Without your help, I don't know what would have happened to my grandfather. If he hadn't been found in time, the situation could have been even worse. Nicholas, touched by Eduarda's sincerity and pain, responded. I only did what anyone would do. But now, we need to ensure that Fabio is safe and well cared for. The conversation between them brought a new sense of urgency and purpose. Both were determined to face the challenges still ahead and to protect Fabio from any further harm. They knew there was still much to be done, but at least the truth was beginning to emerge, and with it, the hope for a fairer and safer future for the elderly man. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. While Eduarda fought to find clues about her grandfather's whereabouts, Estevao seemed to be enjoying a period of prosperity and satisfaction. With each new advancement in business and personal life, the sparkle in Estevao's eyes intensified, as if his happiness was directly linked to Fabio's disappearance. Everything that belonged to Fabio was now controlled by Estevao. The companies, properties, and investments accumulated over years of hard work were transferred to Estevao's name. Estevao's change in status was evident to everyone, and he frequently flaunted his new lifestyle, presenting himself as a man of great success and influence. Eduarda, on the other hand, faced a completely different reality. The relentless search for her grandfather had become her main mission. She invested all her energy and resources into investigations, consulted private detectives, and even used social media to spread information in the hope of finding someone who had seen Fabio. Although she didn't find many leads, her determination didn't wane. She was willing to go to the ends of the earth if necessary to bring Fabio back. Meanwhile, life went on for Estevao. He seemed indifferent to his daughter's search and the suffering his actions caused. His indifference was camouflaged by the facade of success he maintained. At social events, he frequently mentioned how happy and satisfied he was with his life, never once mentioning the disappearance of his father. His behavior was the expression of the calculated coldness of someone who didn't care about the consequences of his actions. Time continued to pass, and with it, Eduarda's pain and frustration grew. 6 years had passed since Fabio's disappearance, and the pain of not knowing what had happened to him never diminished. The relentless search and the difficulties she faced had distanced Eduarda from those around her. Her personal and professional life were severely affected by the search and the constant struggle to overcome her father's betrayal. Eduarda didn't have much to show for her efforts, but her resilience was remarkable. She had become a figure of determination and courage despite the adversities. Each false lead and obstacle only reinforced her desire to find her grandfather and seek justice. She felt a tremendous responsibility on her shoulders, not only for her grandfather but also for the legacy of dignity and integrity she wished to preserve. Months and years passed, but Eduarda's hope never completely waned. She continued her search, always believing that somehow, the truth about what really happened to Fabio was still waiting to be discovered. The story of Fabio and Eduarda was far from resolved, and the weight of Estevao's actions still loomed over everyone involved, like a shadow that could not be ignored. Eduarda decided to leave her home and her relationship with her father behind. With nothing left to lose, she left, taking only the clothes on her back and a small amount of money she had managed to save. The pain of separation and the determination to find her grandfather drove her decision to seek a fresh start. She settled in a new city, where she secured a job as an English teacher at a local school. The change of environment was a relief for Eduarda, providing a refuge from the constant pain and frustration she felt about Fabio's disappearance. The routine at the school helped distract her mind and gave her a sense of purpose, as well as allowing her to support herself and find a new meaning in her life. The work as a teacher was challenging and rewarding. Eduarda dedicated herself wholeheartedly to her students, seizing the opportunity to reinvent herself and rebuild her life. Although she was far from her family and her painful past, the feeling of being in an environment where she could make a difference provided some solace. However, the anguish over her grandfather's whereabouts never left her. Every time she thought of Fabio, the suspicion that her father had something to do with the disappearance was ever present. She immersed herself in her new life, forming new friendships and building a support network that helped her cope with her past traumas. Yet, the sense of injustice persisted. Eduarda remained vigilant for any news or clues about her grandfather. She also tried contacting others, exploring different approaches, and investigating any possibility that could lead to finding Fabio. Her desire to prove Estevao's involvement in the situation never abandoned her. Meanwhile, Estevao continued his life of apparent success and prosperity. His focus was entirely on accumulating wealth and power, and Fabio's absence only alleviated his financial concerns. The disappearance of his father allowed him to gain absolute control over the assets and businesses that had previously belonged to Fabio, and Estevao seemed to be living the pinnacle of his success. His indifference to the pain and suffering caused by his actions was evident in his behavior. Eduarda's distance and resentment did not affect his life as long as he continued to enjoy the money and status he had acquired. Estevao's happiness was directly linked to his wealth and the control he exercised over others' lives. Concern about his father's disappearance never had a place in his life. He surrounded himself with people who admired his success and looked up to him as an example of achievement and power. The indifference he displayed towards his daughter's suffering and his father's disappearance was a reflection of his calculated and selfish nature. Eduarda, on her part, remained steadfast in her struggle, even as the days passed and evidence continued to be scarce. She sought justice not only for Fabio but also for herself and what she believed was right. The pursuit of the truth and the hope of solving the mystery surrounding her grandfather's disappearance were the driving forces that kept her going. The past and her father's betrayal were never forgotten, and her journey of redemption and discovery continued, guided by the belief that, one day, the truth would come to light. Eduarda was determined to uncover more about what had truly happened to her grandfather and sought out every clue she could find. With this in mind, she asked Nicholas to share every detail of the encounter with Fabio. Nicholas, still shaken by the experience, began to recount everything he remembered with precision. He described how he had found Mr. Fabio in the field, lost and disoriented, and how, when taking him home, he noticed that the elderly man had injured feet and was very weak. He showed Eduarda the box of medication that Fabio had with him but hesitated to use due to the lack of information about the drug. Seeing the medication, Eduarda became visibly agitated. She recognized the drug immediately, a type of powerful sedative that Fabio had been using for years. Eduarda's face revealed a mix of relief and anguish. "These are the same sedatives my father used to keep Grandpa lying down. He used them to ensure that Fabio remained inactive, with no reaction throughout the day," she explained, her voice trembling with the revelation. Eduarda began to connect the dots and details that had seemed disconnected until then. The use of these sedatives was not merely a measure to control Fabio's behavior but appeared to be part of a larger plan to keep him under control and prevent him from interfering with Esteveo's plans. The situation became clearer. Even in his weakened condition, Fabio could have been a threat to Esteveo's power and control, and the use of the medication was intended to ensure that he remained unable to speak or move. She began to imagine what else might have happened if the medication was part of the scheme to keep Fabio away. It implied a level of manipulation and cruelty that surpassed what she had imagined. Eduarda wondered if there were other aspects of this plot that had not yet been revealed. The frustration and sadness she felt at seeing the extent of her father's manipulation were immense. With this new information, Eduarda felt even more motivated to find Fabio and bring justice to him. The fact that her father had been responsible for keeping her grandfather in a state of dependency, using medication to keep him passive, confirmed her suspicions and gave her renewed drive for her search. She knew she needed to investigate further and perhaps gather more evidence that could reveal the full truth and expose Esteveo's actions. Touched by Eduarda's determination, Nicholas decided to help her in any way he could. He offered any necessary assistance to seek additional information and review any other details that might have been overlooked. Their collaboration seemed to be the key to unraveling the mystery and, perhaps, finding a way to confront Esteveo and seek justice for Fabio. Eduarda and Nicholas began planning their next steps, determined to uncover the truth and bring to light the injustices that had been committed. They knew the road ahead would be difficult and full of challenges, but the quest for truth and the need for justice provided them with the strength to move forward. Eduarda and Nicholas arrived at the nursing home, an old and imposing building that exuded a sense of calm amidst the turmoil of their situation. The place appeared well maintained, with neatly trimmed gardens and a serene environment. As soon as they entered, they were greeted by a receptionist. Eduarda introduced herself and asked if there was any record of a Mr. Fabio at the nursing home. The receptionist, with a cautious look, informed them that she could not provide information about residents unless the requesters were direct relatives. The response left Eduarda and Nicholas frustrated, as they were seeking any clue that might lead to Fabio's whereabouts. As they left the nursing home, Eduarda and Nicholas felt disheartened, but luck seemed to be on their side. While heading to their car, Eduarda noticed a man talking to one of the nursing home staff. The man looked familiar, and a sense of recognition swept over Eduarda. "Nicholas, do you see that man?" Eduarda asked, her voice filled with concern and curiosity. "He looks familiar to me." Nicholas looked in the direction she pointed and saw the man. He also noticed that there was something unusual about the situation. At first, they couldn't remember where they had seen him before, but Eduarda's expression indicated that she was certain she knew him. Eduarda then recalled a crucial detail. Years ago, when her grandfather Fabio began showing signs of dementia, the family had hired a caregiver to help him. This caregiver was a middle-aged man, with a stern demeanor and a gaze that always seemed to be assessing the situation around him. The same kind of look she saw on the man in front of them. "That man," Eduarda began, her eyes fixed on the figure now heading towards the parking lot. "He was the caregiver we hired for my grandfather when his condition started to deteriorate." The thought that this man might be connected to Fabio's disappearance made Eduarda's anxiety increase. They approached the man, and with a mix of caution and determination, Eduarda addressed him. "Excuse me, sir. I can't help but notice that you look familiar to me. Did you previously work as a caregiver?" Eduarda asked, trying to stay calm. The man, initially surprised, tried to hide his reaction. He looked at Eduarda and Nicholas with an air of perplexity and then tried to look away. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man replied evasively, taking steps backward. Eduarda felt she was close to something significant. Her intuition told her there was a connection between this man and Fabio's disappearance. She tried to gather more information, but the man was clearly trying to evade her. Nicholas, sensing the rising tension, intervened to help. He tried to calm Eduarda and handle the situation, but the man was already moving away quickly. Before they could do anything, he got into his car and sped out of the parking lot. Back in the car, Eduarda and Nicholas were even more determined to uncover the truth. The discovery that the man had a direct link to Fabio's past provided a new crucial lead. Now, they needed to investigate further and uncover the true connection between him and Eduarda's grandfather's disappearance. The frustration turned into a new motivating force. They knew they needed to act quickly to prevent the man from escaping and to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. The quest for justice and truth was becoming increasingly intense, and the connection to Fabio's past seemed to be the key to solving the mystery. After their encounter with the former caregiver, Eduarda and Nicholas felt the urgency to act to help Fabio. Both were motivated but felt powerless in the face of the situation's complexity. Eduarda dropped Nicholas off at his home and decided to personally visit the nursing home, hoping to find a way to help her grandfather. As Eduarda prepared for the visit, Nicholas returned to his routine in the field, but the worry about Fabio and Eduarda's situation constantly lingered. He knew his role in solving the problem was limited, but he was willing to do whatever was necessary to support Eduarda and find a solution. When Eduarda arrived at the nursing home, she found Fabio in an even more debilitated state than expected. The elderly man appeared constantly drowsy and disoriented, a clear result of excessive medication. She tried to interact with him gently, talking and doing her best to awaken him from the lethargic state he was in. However, Fabio had difficulty recognizing his granddaughter and seemed confused and distant. "Grandpa, it's me, Eduarda," she said, trying to elicit a response. "I'm here to help you." Eduarda's frustration grew as she realized that, despite her efforts, Fabio was almost unreachable due to the sedation. She spoke with the nursing home staff and tried to get information about her grandfather's treatment, but faced resistance. The staff, fearing reprisals or complications, were reluctant to provide details. Eduarda was also aware that her father, Estevao, used his influence to keep Fabio sedated and out of any situation that could lead to legal complications. Estevao's influence in society was substantial, and his money seemed to hold power even over the police and other local authorities. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Eduarda and Nicholas kept in constant contact. Every time she managed to visit Fabio, she updated Nicholas on her grandfather's condition and any new information. She reported on how the treatment was affecting Fabio and the difficulties she faced in changing the situation. "Nicholas, the situation is worsening," Eduarda said in one of their calls. "My father is keeping Grandpa in a near comatose state all the time. I'm trying to get some support, but it's very difficult. Even the police can't do much without concrete evidence." Nicholas, though distant, tried to help in any way he could. He began researching laws and regulations related to the treatment of people in nursing homes, trying to find a legal loophole that could be used to help Fabio. He also sought support from elderly rights organizations and tried to gather as much evidence as possible about the situation to help Eduarda make the correct report. Meanwhile, Eduarda was searching for alternatives and trying to gather evidence of abuse and neglect. She sought out other residents and staff members who might have witnessed Estevao's behavior and Fabio's condition. Unfortunately, many were reluctant to speak due to the power and influence of Eduarda's father. With each visit, Eduarda felt more determined but also more exhausted. The reality of fighting against a corrupt system and a powerful figure was overwhelming. However, her love and concern for her grandfather kept her motivated. She knew she needed more evidence and more allies to fight against the power Estevao wielded. Eduarda continued to visit Fabio whenever she could, always looking for a sign that he might recover or a way to expose the truth. She knew that Fabio's situation depended on her perseverance and the collaboration of people willing to help in the fight against injustice. The path was uncertain and challenging, but Eduarda was determined to fight to the end to ensure her grandfather received the care and freedom he deserved. With a desperate plan in mind, Eduarda knew she had to act quickly. She recalled the conversations and information she had gathered and decided that the only way to help Fabio was to confront Estevao directly. The idea was to provoke a reaction that could lead to a revelation, even without concrete evidence. She called Nicholas to help. Together, they devised a plan to confront Estevao. Both were aware of the risks, but they were determined to do whatever it took to free Fabio. Nicholas was nervous, but Eduarda's determination inspired him to act. They prepared for a visit to Estevao's mansion, where they hoped to get some answers about Fabio's fate. When they arrived at the opulent mansion, Eduarda and Nicholas were greeted by a butler who led them to Estevao's office. The luxurious surroundings stood in stark contrast to the desperate situation Fabio was in. When Estevao entered the room, he greeted them with a cold smile, clearly comfortable in his wealth and power. "What brings you here?" Estevao asked with a disdainful expression. Eduarda and Nicholas exchanged a glance, and Eduarda, taking a deep breath, decided to start the conversation. "Mr. Estevao, we came to discuss something very serious," Eduarda said, trying to maintain her composure. "Recently, we discovered some information that could put you in a difficult situation." Estevao raised an eyebrow, visibly interested and somewhat suspicious. "What kind of information?" he asked. Eduarda pulled some papers from her bag, documents she had prepared as part of her plan. She placed them on the table, making sure Estevao could see them without actually reading the content. She was merely trying to create a convincing impression. "These documents prove that you have been involved in keeping my grandfather in a situation of abuse and neglect," Eduarda said, trying to be as convincing as possible. "If we don't take legal action now, all these documents will be handed over to the authorities." Estevao looked at the papers with a look of disdain but didn't seem disturbed. Instead of denying or defending himself, he began to laugh, a cold and cutting sound. "Interesting," Estevao said, still laughing. "And you really think this would intimidate me?" Eduarda and Nicholas were taken aback. The plan was falling apart, but Eduarda decided to press on. "We know you've been controlling everything, even the caregiver at the nursing home. And we know you've been paying well to keep Fabio under control." Estevao stopped laughing, and his gaze became more serious. He looked at Eduarda with a resigned expression. "You're right," he finally said, his voice more grave. "I paid the caregiver to make sure he stayed out of sight. I didn't want my father interfering with my plans and the management of the company." Eduarda was in shock at her father's words. The weight of Estevao's confessions hit her like a wave. Nicholas, beside her, was equally stunned but tried to stay focused. "Why would you do that?" Eduarda asked, her voice trembling. "He was your father." "He was an obstacle," Estevao replied with calculated coldness. "The company and the money were more important. I didn't want him interfering in my life or my decisions." Eduarda felt a wave of anger and sadness but forced herself to remain calm. "You will pay for this, Estevao. Either with the law or by the way we find to expose your cruelty." Estevao didn't seem too worried about the threat. He rose from his chair and, with an indifferent gesture, indicated that the conversation was over. "Do whatever you want," he said. "But I have the resources to deal with anything you try." Eduarda and Nicholas left the mansion with a sense of defeat but also renewed determination. Although the conversation with Estevao hadn't produced the desired effect, his admission of cruelty gave them a basis to seek justice. They knew they needed to find a way to act legally and expose what they had discovered, even in the face of the challenges ahead. As they returned, Eduarda was more determined than ever to ensure Fabio received the help and justice he deserved. Nicholas, though exhausted, was also more committed to helping Eduarda face the powerful enemy they were up against. They knew the fight was far from over, but they were willing to continue the battle for truth and justice. When Fabio's health began to deteriorate, showing signs of dementia, Estevao saw this as an opportunity to get rid of him once and for all. Estevao's goal was clear: eliminate his father from the equation and gain full control of the companies and the vast family fortune. With the help of a corrupt caregiver, he managed to manipulate the situation so that Fabio was removed from his home and taken to a remote location where no one could find him. Estevao paid the caregiver to transport Fabio to a distant town, where he was placed in a nursing home not far from Nicholas's house. For 6 long years, Fabio was confined there, living in an environment where his presence was no more than a shadow of the man he once was. Life in the nursing home, marked by neglect and lack of stimulation, caused Fabio to forget even his identity. His memory gradually disintegrated until he remembered nothing, not even who he was. Fate, however, played an unexpected role in the story. One day, Fabio managed to escape from the nursing home, though he didn't know where he was going. He wandered aimlessly for hours, lost and confused, until he was eventually found by Nicholas, who was on his way to work and came across the old man in a state of despair and weakness. Nicholas and Eduarda, with the help of information they had gathered, managed to locate the elderly man and ensure his well-being. When they confronted Estevao about the situation, the man didn't try to hide the truth. He knew his power and influence gave him a considerable advantage and was willing to use that advantage to fend off any threat. With calculated coldness, Estevao addressed Eduarda and Nicholas. "I know you don't have enough evidence to incriminate me, but I really don't care," Estevao said with a tone of disdain. "You can take this man, I don't want to see him here anymore. I don't have to worry about the consequences because I have enough money and power to stay out of trouble. Take him and leave." Without hesitation, Nicholas and Eduarda removed Fabio from Estevao's mansion. With the old man finally free from oppression and abuse, Eduarda took him to her home. Although Fabio's memory was no longer what it used to be and he continued to struggle to recover parts of his past, he began to reconnect with his granddaughter. Eduarda did her best to provide Fabio with a welcoming and comforting environment, and he started to recognize Eduarda as his granddaughter, feeling more secure and loved. Nicholas, who had become deeply involved in Eduarda's life and her fight for justice, began to visit Eduarda's home regularly. The closeness and mutual support during this difficult period allowed a special connection to form between him and Eduarda. What began as a partnership in the quest for justice and recovery evolved into something deeper, and a romance began to blossom between them. As Fabio's life stabilized and he started to recover emotionally, Eduarda and Nicholas found comfort and joy in each other. Together, they faced adversity and found a way to be happy, joining their lives while continuing to care for and support Fabio in his journey to rebuild what was left of his memory and identity. One day, Eduarda and Nicholas decided to take a drive to relax. During the trip, they passed by the shopping mall under construction and noticed something surprising: the construction was embargoed, with large, interdicted signs visible all around. "So, this company building the mall is my father's," Eduarda commented, with a look of curiosity mixed with concern. "I wonder what happened." The concern led the couple straight to Estevao's office, which was located in a commercial area of the city. When they arrived, they found the place completely empty. The building had a "for rent" sign on the entrance, and the interior seemed abandoned, with furniture and equipment removed. Unable to get answers at the office, they went home and turned on the television to catch the news. The truth unfolded in the reports: Estevao's company had gone bankrupt. The news detailed how all the businessman's assets had been seized to cover the debts and defaults accumulated over the years he had been in control of the company. Estevao's drastic fall from a successful businessman to someone with nothing was covered extensively by the media. Eduarda and Nicholas watched the reports in silence, the news settling over them like a heavy curtain. 4. Eduarda, the fall of her father, however painful, was a reflection of his own actions and his lack of morality. For Nicholas, it was a chance to move on and start over, leaving behind the conflicts that had brought so much suffering. As they continued their journey, Fabio found happiness and support with Eduarda and Nicholas. Though the past was full of pain and loss, the future held the hope of healing and the chance to build a new life filled with love and shared goals. The story of Fabio, Eduarda, and Nicholas became a reminder that, even in the face of adversity, family and love can endure. The end of Estevao's empire represented a new beginning, a chance to leave behind everything that had caused suffering and build a better future for all of them. Eduarda and Nicholas continued to live with Fabio, determined to protect and support him in his remaining years. Despite the shadows that had once surrounded them, they found a light to guide them forward, toward a brighter and more promising future.